Hello and welcome to video lecture 1A, Moral Dilemmas, Moral Decisions, and Moral Reasoning. This is the first of many video lectures you will study as part of BA 417. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about the very closely related words morality and ethics and all the words that go with them, like moral, ethical, etc. Morality is that dimension of life in which we distinguish not simply between what is and what is not the case, between truth and falsehood, but we also distinguish further between what should be and what should not be the case, what situations are good or bad, what actions are right or wrong. Now, a famous thinker once said of the concept of time, "I know what it is until you ask me what it is, then I am no longer sure." The same is true of many of the most important concepts we use every day, including the deceptively simple concept of morality. We're often quite sure of our judgments about morality, but if we're challenged on them, we often find it very difficult to defend them. At the very least, we can't defend them well enough to convince those who disagree with us to change their minds. And this is because we often aren't even sure of why we believe those judgments. What makes something right or wrong? This is where ethics comes in. Ethics is the systematic attempt to clarify and understand the key concepts that define and order our moral lives. That is, ethics tries to make clear how we think about morality, why we make the moral judgments we do. In fact, ethics is sometimes called moral philosophy. So the basic relationship between morality and ethics is that ethics attempts to identify and clarify the principles and convictions, etc., that generate and inform our moral judgments. In other words, ethics is the study of morality and decision making. But it is morality itself and those moral decisions we make that affect the world around us and the people in that world. And those decisions and the effects they have are the primary concern of this class. So, this is an ethics class, but it is an ethics class that focuses on moral decisions and their effects and our responsibility for those effects. Now, the ethics we are primarily concerned with in this class is the kind of ethics that studies morality and moral decision making within a business context. Business ethics is one example of what's called professional ethics. Professionals have specific and unique moral concerns, since they have, by nature of their positions, legal responsibilities, fiduciary responsibilities, and other duties to the people for whom they provide advice, guidance, and service. Business leaders are professionals in this sense. So are healthcare providers, attorneys, teachers, administrators, and others. So it is professional ethics, and in particular business ethics, that will be the focus of this class. The problem we face as ethical business leaders is the moral dilemma. A moral dilemma is an undesirable situation because no matter what you do, it looks like you're going to do something wrong. It's what we're dealing with when we speak of choosing the lesser of two evils, or when we say pick your poison, or damned if you do, damned if you don't. Would you tell a lie in order to save a friend a lot of trouble or a lot of money? Would you steal medications you can't afford in order to save your spouse's life? Moral dilemmas are the only occasion in which we really have to bother with thinking through what we should do. If it's obvious what one choice is right and which one is wrong, then there's nothing to think about. We just do the right thing. We do that, right? Okay. But faced with a moral dilemma, we need to make a moral decision. In other words, we need to come to the decision that despite appearances, one of our choices is the right thing to do in this situation. The only way to arrive at a good and justifiable moral decision is through moral reasoning. Reasoning, of course, is the critical analysis process we go through when making any important decision. Moral reasoning, then, is the critical analysis process concerning a decision about morality. Good moral reasoning requires three kinds of input: moral principles, information, and deliberation. So first, we must consult the moral principles that are relevant to the decision we must make. There's a lot of debate in philosophical ethics over just what moral principles are and how we can know them. But this is not a philosophical ethics class, so we will not bother with these questions, though they are a lot of fun to think about. For our purposes, we can agree that moral principles are general guidelines about proper moral behavior, such as honesty or justice. Furthermore, the moral principles we will be talking about in this class are intuitively clear. That is, their position as moral principles is not really debated by anyone. It seems obvious that these principles should be followed. Again, think about honesty and justice. Do you know anyone who would seriously say that we should not pursue these ideals? We'll talk a lot more about moral principles in the next video lecture. But second, we're going to need some information. We'll need to make sure, first of all, that we are clear on all the relevant facts. That is, the facts that must be considered in order to make a good moral decision. We will also need to identify the relevant stakeholders and the interests of those stakeholders that are at stake in the decision to be made. Now, we'll talk a lot more about stakeholders and their interests in week 2 of this class. For now, we can just say that a stakeholder is any person who is significantly affected by a decision that we make. This is where morality really kicks in. In business, we often make decisions that will affect the lives of many people in significant ways: managers, employees, customers, suppliers, the local community, etc. When what we do changes people's lives, whether they like it or not, we must think carefully and critically about whether or not we have the right to impose on their lives in those ways. And finally, we need to do some deliberating. This is the weighing and evaluating process that gets us from the. Finally, we need to do some deliberating. This is the weighing and evaluating process that gets us from the recognition of a moral dilemma to the resolution of a moral decision. So, deliberation is at the very heart of moral reasoning. Proper deliberation requires several steps. First, we must identify exactly what the moral dilemma is. In other words, we need to define as specifically as possible exactly what the moral problem is that needs to be solved. We also need to identify any alternative solutions. What are all the realistic options that we have in trying to resolve this problem? With those alternatives identified, we need to apply the relevant moral principles. That is, we should decide which moral principles support which alternatives. 3 key points about this. First, a given alternative may be supported by more than one principle. Second, one moral principle may seem to lend support to more than one alternative. That's okay. Just note it in both places and move on. Finally, If there does not seem to be any moral principle that supports a given alternative, then that is not a moral alternative and should be dropped from the list. We should then make a list of pros and cons for each of these alternatives. These may be moral pros and cons, or they may simply be practical pros and cons. But as much as possible, we need to understand what the upside and the downside of each option is. Now, most of the time, the best way to think about pros and cons is in terms of benefit and harm for the stakeholders affected by the action. And again, we'll talk much more about stakeholders in week 2. But for here, we just need to realize that we need to look at the pros and cons in terms of how will the lives of stakeholders be affected for better or worse. And finally, we need to subject all that we've learned to a process of criticism and weighing. Given the facts, given the stakeholder interest, given the applicable principles, the alternative actions, and their pros and cons, how do these alternatives compare to one another? And in the end, when the smoke has cleared, which is the best thing to do? Now, once this last question is answered, the moral reasoning process is over. We have moved from deliberation to decision. So, these are the necessary components of good moral reasoning: moral principles, information, deliberation. And in video lecture 1B, we will look in much more detail at the concept of moral principles.